What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about the price increases that the gaming industry is seeing pretty much across the board for your more standard releases. Mobile games and free-to-play will continue on in their current manner, I'm sure, but most of your first-party AAA releases have decided to go up to $70 US as the base price. Now, this was brought up again recently as even more companies came out and decided that this was the way to go, and it's been on my mind as someone who plays and reviews games all the time, so I wanted to make this video about it. Now, even as somebody who gets review copies, I spend more on gaming than your average person by quite a bit. In 2022, I spent about $1,400 specifically on buying games to cover for the channel, which is of course a little bit different from someone buying these games just to play them, as I will be making money off of them, so spending that money is less of a concern for me overall, but nonetheless, it is money that I spend on them, and chances are, if you watch a video like this, you yourself probably buy more games than the average person as you're consuming secondary media about the subject. But for gamers at large, I think this price increase has the potential to lead to even more disappointment in these releases, as an increase in price makes the pressure on that game being a worthwhile experience even greater than it already is. And ultimately, I think this price increase is going to drive more people into subscription services as well as the free-to-play mobile market, which a lot of the market is already comprised of, to be honest. Let's talk about the why first. Now, I do think it's worth mentioning here at the beginning, roughly, of the video, though, that regional pricing and things like that vary wildly, so I will be talking pretty much in US dollars, as that is where I'm from, and the currency I deal with every day, but I do recognize that only about 30-ish% of my audience is from the US as well, so there's bound to be some variation there. But let's talk about the why this increase is supposedly happening. Now, obviously, the marketing or the press releases we get about this are basically that the games are becoming more and more expensive to make, and inflation hit particularly hard this year, so they've had to make these price increases to make up for it. And honestly, that's probably true to some degree. AAA games at full price have been $60 for a significant amount of time. However, I do think that information leaves one critical aspect of the conversation out, and that is that these days, depending on where you look, like 80 to 83% of video game sales are done digitally. And previously, that AAA price incorporated the cost of actually producing and distributing that game as a physical release. So digital sales have pretty much completely removed that aspect of the business, which cut costs. And that's especially important when you look at handling these things at scale, because when you cut out a significant portion of the physical product requirements, putting it on discs, actually distributing it, the shipping involved in that, you're taking away tons of the cost just by stripping that away. And I think that change had a large impact on why it's taken so long for us to see video games rise in price. But with games becoming more difficult and elaborate and expensive to make, I do think it was likely to happen eventually. But even so, most AAA games are usually still profitable outside of a massive flop, even at $60. And I tell you all that because my personal opinion on the why is that it's probably a little bit of both sides being somewhat true. There is likely a need to increase the price at some point because games are getting more expensive to make. But on the other hand, a lot of AAA games were still profitable, very much so at $60. More so probably when you're looking at selling things at scale to offset costs. So some of it is almost certainly an executive worried about their earnings reports, I'm sure. So that's pretty much the why. But now let's talk about the results and some of the things I think are likely to happen as a consequence. So for starters, it's no secret that subscription services and mobile gaming have honestly kind of dominated the market. Game Pass comes up a lot, which is a pretty great way to play first-party titles for very cheap, especially when they're added day one. And that's probably the biggest in terms of subscription services, but there are of course others like PlayStation's. And purely from a monetary standpoint, that's a great deal. It's like $15 a month. You can play a ton of different games at your own pace with no real concern about paying for each one individually. Developers have come out and said it's been very beneficial for them. So it's no secret why that service is growing. And as a result of price increases to $70, where people don't want to risk spending $70 on a game that might very well turn out to be disappointing, it is a much easier sell to be like, hey, why don't you buy this subscription for $15, and then you can not only try that game, but a ton of others as well. And that, I think, is likely going to be the key driver in terms of what we see happen. I think even more people are going to jump onto that subscription service purely because it is going to be probably the most bang for your buck. But even then, the story doesn't really end there, because while we're talking about the gaming industry at large, free-to-play in mobile gaming is dominating in terms of its revenue and earnings. It just is. Which is funny because a lot of people, mobile gamers in particular, probably don't identify themselves as gamers in the traditional sense. And moreover, what those people want from their video games, specifically their mobile games obviously, and what someone like myself wants from a full-fledged console or PC release are two very different things. And while it's not strictly related to this video, I confess that I'm curious about how the future pans out when these mobile games are just making money hand over fist from people that are quite frankly easier to please, while people like myself and likely many of the people watching this video who enjoy more traditional releases have to deal with things like rising costs, etc. And I can't help but wonder how that's going to affect the market in the long term, because we already see a lot of gaming companies chasing after that mobile dollar, and it makes for a somewhat uncertain future as to what's going to happen in the long term. At the same time, I don't think full-priced regular games are going away. I think they're just more likely to be pushed onto subscription services in an effort to compete with the money being made on mobile, because while you certainly do get a lot of people who are simply passionate about the games they make and want to make things like CRPGs and these deep games that I enjoy, if that's not where the money is, that is not where corporations are going to be. Corporations are legally required to look after their shareholders, which means going where the money is, which is mobile gaming. And I think as a result of this, a lot of our, again, more traditional console and PC releases at full price are going to be pushed into subscription services, with games likely being monetized further at that AAA level with things like microtransactions, which I find incredibly frustrating, because I imagine for a lot of people like myself who enjoy these games, seeing a $70 game come out that then includes microtransactions in some way as an attempt to monetize further is going to be even more upsetting. And the problem with this, however, is that that's ultimately a very vocal minority, because as mobile gaming has proven, and honestly even just regular games with microtransactions have proven, the vast majority of the audience, the people who don't watch this secondary media, for instance, do not care that these things are here. But as I mentioned, I really don't think we have to be concerned about these types of games ever going away or anything, as there is a huge audience for them. I just think it's going to push people to playing them on subscription services where the price is less daunting, especially for people who aren't paying potentially $1,000+ for various game releases like myself, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's saving people a lot of money while also making these games profitable at scale, because that could very well potentially be what allows us to see more of them in spite of a market that is increasingly dominated by mobile, for instance. And before we wrap the video up, I think I would be remiss not to include a section of this video where we talk about indie games. Because while AAA game prices are rising, indie and AA tend to be a bit more reasonable while also really being drivers of innovation at the same time, as a lot of unique and different experiences come from indie games which have less riding on a potential failure. More often than not, big AAA experiences play it very, very safe, which, as I mentioned earlier, is largely down to their legal responsibility to look after shareholders first. There is not a ton of room for experimentation on their end without getting sued. Indie developers, as well as many AA developers, are less bound by this problem. And while they, of course, still need to be profitable to some degree, they have the leeway to make decisions that benefit the game that they want to make. And I think this is why we see so much, again, innovation, as well as more often than not, just better experiences in the indie scene where they can focus on the thing they want to do and do it really well. Because for every big AAA release that I actually enjoy, there's at least a dozen indies that were cheaper and more fun. And I think it would be foolish to discount the indie scene, which is largely ran by people who are incredibly passionate about the games that they want to make, at a price that is much more reasonable on someone's wallet than $70 for a game that may or may not turn out to be good. Which leaves us with two outcomes, I imagine. More attention for indies who don't charge $70, and the likely growth of subscription services. And before we wrap this thing up, just as a reminder, while this probably goes without saying for people watching a video like this, I think with these rising prices, it's more important than ever to do as much research as you can into these products before you buy them, via things like reviews, gameplay, that type of stuff, to try and make sure that if you are paying $70 for a game, that you get a game you actually enjoy instead of just rolling the dice on it. And while that's never going to be a foolproof system, I do think it's going to become more important as these prices rise, especially across 2023. But that's more or less all I've got for you guys. I think the price increase is unfortunate, but we'll have to see how it pans out ultimately. Again, though, for me, I think subscription services are just going to keep growing as a result, which is likely the intended effect, if I'm being completely honest. Though all of that said, I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.